I want to turn now to someone that I've been able to get to know just recently, as Tomas Calderon has joined Heart+Mind Strategies. Tomas is a recipient of the Global Learning Medallion from Florida International University. He studied business management, market research, Latin American and East Asian cultures, and he's an avid consumer of educational social issues content. And I can validate that this is true. And he says that he spends time either chatting up a storm with those around him, or daydreaming. Now, Tomas, coming into a brand new job in the midst of all of this and working now with us at Heart+Mind Strategies, talk to me about what you're seeing in the way you view the world and what you see the opportunity on this idea of strengthening connections.
So I'd like to start by saying that this start of the decade has been a transformative period for many people, and the wide-ranging effects of the pandemic and the visibility of social unrest has really affected most of us in more than a few ways. And I guess to start with an anecdote, back in 2020, I went through an incredibly difficult period where I had panic attacks and I was mildly depressed for months on months, and I developed a lot of anxiety. One of the most difficult things during that period was explaining what I was going through to those around me without being overcome with emotion. I didn't have the words or ideas to talk about my experience, and those conversations were very emotionally taxing. But my inability to make a case for myself didn't change the reality of what I was going through, and the fact that others couldn't see past my emotional state didn't negate my struggle. And I give this anecdote to expand on 3 ideas about empathy. The first is the limit of empathy, which seems a little paradoxical when you're starting to talk about it, no? But a way of seeing this is imagining your capacity for empathy as exclusively what you can see illuminated by streetlights at night. When you can act as either the world is captured by those lights, because that's all you can see, but more than likely you're aware that there's more to the world than what the light touches. And that latter bit is being aware of the limits of your empathy. In my personal anecdote, I sometimes took issue when someone was angry or frustrated as they explained something. And I think many of us do. It's a little hard to empathize with someone when they're kind of angry. I didn't think their expression was bad, but I couldn't quite look past it. Yet after 2020, I had a personal experience with this. And that experience informed how I perceive and react to what they're saying. It's an example of where my limits were at the time. And to this day, it's an eye-opening reminder that I didn't and perhaps couldn't truly know what someone is going through or what someone has lived through. Which brings me to the second idea, which is expanding those limits through empathetic learning and inclusion. These last years have hopefully reminded everyone that we don't all have the same life experience. And it's not enough to know just on the surface level what the facts or data points are. You have to place yourself in the frames of reference of those who you're trying to understand, or even what you're trying to understand. Empathetic learning is one of the methods to expanding your lights is putting yourself in multiple points of view as you absorb information. This can include physical and psychological positioning in someone else's frame. For example, automakers sometimes develop an empathy belly that mimics a pregnant body, and engineers wear it as they develop vehicles and features. It also means interacting and including people from different backgrounds, cultures, whatever it is, and having them be a part of your thinking, either in private or in the workplace, gives you the opportunity to expand your capacity for empathy, and it better informs your actions. Now, for me, after I saw help for my mental health, I learned the words and examples, and I shared those with my family. And that learning was both on my side and their side, because as I gained information, I was able to understand and recognize where others had a gap in their information about neurodivergence. And on their end, they were able to understand what I was going through. And we were able to have better conversations. They were able to challenge some of my thoughts more effectively. And in the months since that time, I've reflected a lot on what is now my last point, which is the demand for empathy. And after the period we've had since 2020, everything from the events at the Capitol on January 6th, the reach of social justice movements, and even the Great Resignation, it's evident there's a lot of frustration and anger from the American populace that needs to be addressed. And the demand for understanding and action is here. When you don't empathize, you lose out on employees, on crucial information and relationships. And I think you also sometimes find yourself with frustrated stakeholders who they just won't accept the status quo. And in response to that, I think it's in each of our wills to find space for empathy. And those who do prepare themselves to address difficult questions with the broadest of perspectives. To close, I guess empathy isn't meant to solve issues. It opens the possibility for everyone to speak and understand each other. And it's an iterative process that probably can get tense, but the outcomes are comprehensive ideas and a wider breadth of understanding of needs. To address the topic, when I look at the future of human connection, I echo what was just said. I worry about individuals siloed in echo chambers and a lack of understanding leading to conflict, but I still strongly believe we'll reach a point where both within and as communities, we're able to have empathy, and that empathy will make us be willing to look towards a dark night and expand that vision.
Thank you so much on that. Tomas, one thing you'll try to do differently next year to have more empathy, what would it be? Putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I think I'll probably engage with people that have a stronger opinion on something that is different from me. I just had this experience a few weeks ago with someone, and it was, it was on a topic that I knew more about, but it was still very interesting. And it's a perspective that I think I've had before. I traveled a lot through rural communities, and that experience of being in a rural community is very informative when you come from a city.
Love that. Love that purposeful and intentional trying to engage with somebody that has something different. In fact, Leah Demark has been a joy to be able to get to know in this last little bit. She's joined us at Heart and Mind. She's in her self-described introduction, a 30-year-old wife and new mom to a lively 16-month-old daughter. And she switched gears from spending over a decade in the sports industry. She's a very successful and accomplished swimming coach, and is now bounced over to figuring out the ways to really connect with people, either one-on-one or in team environments. And as you can tell from the pictures, that when she's not working, she's bouncing in that full mom mode, chasing around her little toddler. So Leah, give us your sense of kind of what you've heard today and what you would take on this of your main points.
Thanks, Mari, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel. I'm very thrilled with the opportunity to discuss these topics with all of you. So, I first wanted to touch base and kind of, circle back to something that Matt said in our very first presentation, which when he was talking about algorithms and how it's impacted social media. And I 100%, when you said that, my smile just lit up, because I completely agree. And that was actually something that I wanted to talk about as well, because I believe that these algorithms have this unintended consequence that has really made social media almost like this double-edged sword. When we're seeing things come through our news feed based on relevancy, it just means that, we're seeing what we want to see based on our history of behavior. And social media can either broaden our horizons or it can narrow our focus, depending on what we see and what we consume. And very similar to how we are what we eat physically, in a sense, we are mentally and emotionally what we consume on media platforms. And when we are, I feel like we can all agree that we are living in this world that's very divided. Mari mentioned that 64% of Americans currently believe that we're being driven further apart from each other. And when all of these polarizing beliefs are being exchanged over these platforms, this issue arises when we only see this information from people who think and act and speak similarly to what we do. And it just reminded me of this quote that I saw earlier this month that essentially said, if you're only researching information to validate your current way of thinking, it's not real research, right? And this is the same thing. So I found that if we find commonalities somewhere where we don't expect it, we grow. But if we don't consume new information or information that's contrary to our current way of thinking, we actually limit our growth. And I just think that it's something that we need to take note of and just be a little cautious about moving forward. But on the flip side, I have found, and I'm about to share with you guys, a video chat app that I've leveraged that has actually helped me connect with people over the past 2 years. And it's called Marco Polo. So this is a free app. It's free to anyone to use. And essentially the nature of it is you can text video messages back and forth. You know, we all would agree that we've missed many of each other's milestones over the past 2 years. And this app has been a really great tool for me to catch up with those close in proximity to me, but also far away, sometimes even across the country. And it's actually surprised me when I sat back and reflected about it, that the people I'm closest with are the people that I talk to on this platform, and not necessarily the people I text or sometimes see in person. And I honestly think it's because this app is more of a hybrid between our two realities. You know, our face-to-face connection that we all really crave. And I think that's something that Ellie's going to talk about here shortly after me, where, you know, we need to hear the tone and the inflection in each other's voices. We need to see those facial expressions and be able to measure those things with the human eye. It's very, very important to us. And I think that's kind of blended with the convenience of the technology within this app, where, you know, it's in my phone and it's ready for me when I'm ready to listen and I'm ready to respond. And as a busy mom, as Mari said, I'm always chasing around my lively toddler. She's all over the place. I don't have time personally to, you know, link up schedules with my best friend and video chat just then and there. So that convenience factor has been a game changer for me. But switching gears from social media, I think the number one thing that I wanted to discuss with you all today is just the power of vulnerability. And this links in so much with what we've already touched upon. I feel like everything's connected, right? And at our core, as Cecilia mentioned earlier, we really desire to be loved and accepted for who we truly are, our authentic selves. And you cannot have connection without vulnerability. And Brene Brown has this incredibly powerful TED Talk that is over a decade old, but it's timeless in my eyes. And I'm going to drop the link in the chat. And I encourage you to watch it. It's on the power of vulnerability. And if you have seen it before, which I'm sure a lot of you have, I would encourage you to revisit it. So some of the things that I absolutely love that she talks about are the fact that vulnerability is really rooted in shame and fear, which if you stop and think about it, you know, shame is our fear of not being included, right? But I won't spoil all of her secrets. It's absolute fabulous watch. She's a great storyteller. It's very entertaining. It's like a great way to spend your afternoon. But you know, something else that Cecilia briefly touched on is that we all essentially want to know that we're not alone. And I think shared experiences in particular are one very, very easy way to connect with one another. And I wanted to give you all an example of this and how it's kind of influenced my life, because I always try to lead a life of vulnerability and always try to be my authentic self and let people kind of come to me. And so kind of when I'm describing my story as a human, I always mention that I'm a survivor of a traumatic brain injury. And it's funny because when I say I'm a survivor, people often assume that I'm talking about I survived the incident. But in reality, what I'm talking about is that I survived the decade-long aftermath of living with an invisible illness and all of that entails. And I found that even though it doesn't define me as a person, I usually just mention it in passing. It has drawn so many different people to me because there are a lot of people, and this is just one example of shared experiences, but you know, I've had so many people come to me and say, wait, you too? And even though they didn't particularly have a brain injury, there's something about when you have an invisible illness that, you know, if I were to wear a cast, everyone could see it, but there's something about when you can't see it and you can't measure it with the human eye, how it just doesn't really exist to people. And that can be really difficult. And I had all these people come to me and share their stories, and they all had things in common that I wanted to share with you all. They all essentially said, nobody understands, but you understand, you get it. And that's powerful in and of itself. But then most of them, the vast majority of them said, I actually stopped talking about it because nobody understood. And I feel like they created almost this burden on themselves of not being able to share these experiences because they didn't think anybody would understand. But I think taking a step back from my conversations with all of them, some commonalities that I saw were that they all wanted their experiences validated by somebody who gets it and not dismissed. And also, I think the most powerful takeaway for me was just visibly seeing the amount of relief that came over these individuals, just knowing that they were not alone and that they could share these experiences, and that because they found somebody that kind of understands them on that level, was something that impacts them and their human story so significantly. I think that has created these opportunities and really opened these doorways for me to connect personally with people in ways that now I'm going to be connected to them forever. So I think that that's just one powerful example. But I really encourage all of you guys to, be very open about your shared experiences. And I think you'd really be surprised at where it takes you.
Love it. Thank you for the authenticity and the openness on that very much. And thank you all for that dialogue.